There is a certain kind of quiet that belongs only to Dragon Ball. A stillness that lives underneath everything the series has ever shown, beneath every eruption of golden light and every mountain-shattering shockwave. The history of transformation in this universe is longer and stranger and more layered than it might first appear, stretching from the earliest pages of Akira Toriyama's original manga all the way to forms that were still being drawn decades later. Tonight, we trace that history slowly, from the very first change a fighter's body ever underwent in this world, through every milestone and every quiet surprise, all the way to the most recent edge of what the series has revealed. Rest easy wherever you are, and subscribe if calm Dragon Ball stories help you find peace at the end of a long day, as we drift together through the complete catalog of Dragon Ball transformation, moving gently, in no particular hurry, beginning with something the series showed us very early that most people have long since forgotten. The very first transformation the Dragon Ball series ever brought to its audience was not golden hair or a divine ritual, or anything that would be remembered in the same breath as the moments that defined the franchise. It was something quieter, stranger, borrowed from folklore rather than invented whole, a condition that the series introduced without fanfare, and then allowed to pass from notice almost immediately. In the earliest stretch of the original Dragon Ball story, there existed among certain Earthlings an affliction that caused them to shift between human and wolf-like forms, depending on the presence or absence of the moon. The wolf-like state was not the transformed one in the usual sense. It was the default, the condition the afflicted person would fall into during daylight hours when the moon was hidden. Full moonlight restored them to their human appearance, reversing the ordinary logic of the werewolf legend most listeners would already carry in their minds. It was a gentle inversion, small and easy to overlook, and the series offered it without dwelling on it. This transformation, sometimes recorded in reference material under the name the Wolfman form, carried with it a physical increase in capability. Strength rose, and the body became more formidable in combat than an ordinary untrained human would have been. But the increase was modest, bounded by the limits of what an afflicted but otherwise ordinary person could achieve. It was not sufficient to overcome the refined techniques of a martial arts master. In the contest that the series staged to demonstrate this, the fighter using the transformed state was defeated cleanly by Jackie Chan, the alias that the legendary Master Roshi used to compete incognito at the World Martial Arts Tournament. The form fell to technique, which was a lesson the series would repeat in different registers many times over its long history. What made the Wolfman transformation particularly interesting as a starting point for this catalog was what it was not. It had no connection to the Blood-Wave phenomenon, the specific atmospheric radiation emitted by moonlight that the series would later establish as the trigger for the most important transformation in Saiyan biology. It could be undone through hypnosis, which immediately placed it in a different category from the physiological changes that would come later. It was a surface condition, almost psychological in nature, reversible by the right kind of mental intervention rather than locked into the fighter's cells. In that sense, it was the series at its most innocent, a transformation that felt like a fairy tale more than a power system, and that belonged entirely to the world Dragon Ball occupied before it understood what kind of story it was going to become. Before you drift into sleep, you are welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. The second Earthling transformation, and perhaps the most enduring one in terms of the character associated with it, belonged to Master Roshi himself, the ancient martial arts master who trained Goku and Krillin, whose eccentric personality and tremendous underlying capability had made him one of Dragon Ball's most beloved figures long before the story grew into the scale it eventually reached. Roshi's transformation was called Max Power, and it was exactly what that name suggested, a deliberate concentration of ki into the muscles, inflating them far beyond what any ordinary Earthling's body would be expected to support. When Roshi entered this state, his physical frame changed dramatically. The modest, slightly hunched figure of an elderly man gave way to something enormous and dense with power. The muscles of his chest and arms and legs expanding until the transformation looked less like enhancement and more like the introduction of a completely different person. The aura around him intensified, and the sense of pressure that radiated from the form made the surrounding air feel different in quality. The power output available to Roshi in max power was significantly greater than his ordinary state, and the form allowed him to gather and release key attacks of considerable scale without the need for extensive preparation or movement. He could stand still and unleash energies that no ordinary fighter could approach. The form also had applications in close-range physical combat, though the series tended to show it most memorably in the context of those long-distance energy releases. For viewers who came to the earlier Dragon Ball series after years of Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Ball Super, Max Power inevitably drew comparisons to the Super Saiyan grades and their characteristic muscle inflation. The visual logic was similar enough to suggest a parallel, a family resemblance between Roshi's concentrated ki and the charged states of the Saiyan transformation lineage. But the series never drew that connection explicitly, and the mechanical details did not support a direct equivalency. Max Power showed none of the characteristic drawbacks that would define the inflated muscle grades of Super Saiyan. There was no collapse of speed, no particular emotional cost, no transformation-specific stamina drain beyond the ordinary expense of holding concentrated ki. The most likely explanation the series implied without stating was simpler than any structural connection to Saiyan forms. It was costly in terms of stamina to maintain, and for an elderly man who had other ways of deploying his capability, the practical calculus of using it constantly simply did not compute. Roshi was a figure of tremendous strategic intelligence and deliberate restraint. He chose not to use max power because it was expensive, not because he could not sustain it. And in the later arcs of the series, including the Tournament of Power, where Roshi appeared as a participant and acquitted himself with the kind of quiet dignity that had always defined him at his best, the form surfaced again to remind viewers that the original Dragon Ball world had its own deepest waters, even if the scale of those depths had long since been dwarfed by what came after. The Namekian transformations occupied a different space in the Dragon Ball universe than any of the Saiyan forms. They were biologically distinct, operating through mechanisms that the Namekian race carried in their cells as a species characteristic, rather than as something unlocked through combat or emotional breakthrough. The first and most visually straightforward of them was the form called the Great Namekian, the Giant State, the form that turned a Namekian warrior into something that dwarfed the buildings around it. The Daizenshu guidebooks, which served as the closest thing to official encyclopedic records for the Dragon Ball universe, offered a physiological explanation for how this worked. The Namekian in question would concentrate the nervous system throughout the entirety of the body simultaneously, stimulating cellular activity in a way that produced rapid and enormous expansion. The body would grow to a scale that shifted the combat encounter entirely, the user becoming something closer to an environmental feature than an individual fighter. The Great Namekian form appeared in the main canon of the Dragon Ball Z anime primarily through Piccolo, whose long history with it stretched back to the Saiyan saga and continued through his later appearances. Android 73, a being whose defining ability was the capacity to copy and retain the techniques of those it absorbed, also demonstrated the form after gaining access to Piccolo's biological toolkit. The form created an enormous strategic advantage in terms of presence and psychological weight. Standing before something 17 times one's ordinary height was not a neutral experience for any opponent, regardless of their power level. But the Daisu and the series itself both made something clear that casual observation might have missed. The Great Namekian form was, in a meaningful sense, a bluff in terms of its power statistics. Speed was not significantly impaired by the expansion, which was itself a notable achievement for a transformation of such radical scale. Strength increased, but only modestly, not dramatically enough to turn a losing fight into a victory. The form's strength was its disorienting quality, its ability to reshape the terms of an encounter, rather than simply increase the numbers associated with the user. In Dragon Ball Super Superhero, the form appeared again in Piccolo's hands, and the context clarified something that earlier appearances had left somewhat ambiguous. The great Namekian form could be stacked on top of other Namekian transformations. It was not a base state exclusive technique, but something that could be layered. This detail would become important later in the story, and its significance was quiet but real. The form had always seemed like a starting point technique, something from the earlier vocabulary of the series that had been superseded. What Superhero demonstrated was that it was actually a component, one piece of a larger capability that had never been fully assembled before. The Namekian transformation, known as potential unleashed in its Namekian expression, occupied a subtler space than the giant form. It did not announce itself with a change in scale. It arrived in the visible world as a smoothing of texture, the lines along the Namekian's arms becoming less pronounced, the skin taking on a faint yellow hue, the overall appearance settling into something that suggested resolution without urgency. What had changed beneath that surface was the depth of accessible power, the ceiling of what could be drawn upon in a given moment. The mechanism was broadly comparable to the potential unlocking techniques that appeared elsewhere in the series, most notably the ritual that Elder Guru of Namek had performed on visitors during the events of the Frieza saga, sensing the potential within them and drawing the surface of it toward activation. The Namekian version of this unlocking required a mentor of sufficient capacity and a student of sufficient development, and the result was a transformation that multiplied the fighter's capability several-fold in a single application. The only confirmed appearance of this form in the main Dragon Ball Super storyline involved Piccolo against Gamma 2, the android whose combat capability was one of the central threats in the Dragon Ball Super superhero narrative. The potential unleashed form gave Piccolo a meaningful power increase, but was not sufficient to overcome Gamma 2's resistance on its own. This established both what the form could do and what it could not, placing it clearly in the hierarchy of Namekian capability as a significant step without claiming to be a final one. There was also a detail surrounding young Namekians that the series acknowledged without fully resolving. Dende, the Namekian who had served as Earth's guardian after the fusion of Kami and Piccolo, had his potential unlocked by Elder Guru on Namek and showed no visible transformation as a result. The current understanding of Namekian potential unleashed suggested the form was specific to warrior type or fully developed Namekians, a distinction the series maintained without explaining exhaustively. And then there was Orange Piccolo, the form at the far end of Namekian transformation as the series had shown it, the one that arrived through circumstances unlike any transformation that had come before it. Orange Piccolo was the result of a wish made to Shenron, the divine dragon born from the Dragon Balls, created by the Namekian whose two halves had become Kami and King Piccolo. Piccolo himself, carrying the merged essence of both those halves after his reunification with Kami during the Android saga, made a request. What Shenron granted was an additional reserve of power, something that training and potential unlocking could not have reached through the ordinary paths available. The relationship between Shenron and Piccolo carried within it a particular resonance. Shenron was originally the creation of Kami, whose essence now resided within Piccolo. Some interpretations of the lore suggested that what Shenron returned to Piccolo was not entirely new power but something old, the accumulated capability that Kami had gathered during centuries as Earth's guardian, flowing back to the being who now carried both halves of that original Namekian soul. This reading had never been confirmed in any official material, but it had a poetic logic that sat comfortably within the symbolism the series tended to use. The form's visual identity was striking and layered. Piccolo's size increased, the body expanding in a way that suggested the power within it was pressing against ordinary physical limits. His skin shifted to orange, a warm, saturated tone that felt immediately connected to the Dragon Balls themselves, as though the gift and the giver had left their color on the one who received it. Red markings appeared across his form, his antennae lifted upward rather than hanging at their ordinary angle. And on his back, a symbol appeared, the mark of the Ajisa tree, the enormous trees native to Namek that Namekians grew from seed and tended as the physical expression of their life force. This was one of the quieter details in the form's visual design, easily overlooked, but it tied Orange Piccolo to Namek's ecology and Piccolo's deepest biological heritage in a way that felt intentional. The capability that Orange Piccolo represented was demonstrated clearly in Dragon Ball Super Superhero. It was sufficient to handle one of the Gamma androids with relative ease, placing it above potential Unleashed in a way that made the hierarchy legible. In the battle with Cellmax, the engineered monster that served as the arc's final threat, Orange Piccolo could engage meaningfully, could land blows that registered, could participate in a fight that would otherwise have been entirely one-sided. The great Namekian form could be layered on top, as already noted, creating a configuration that combined the scale of the giant form with the amplified power of Orange Piccolo, a stacking that no other transformation in the series had previously demonstrated in quite the same way. The Saiyan-human hybrid transformations existed in a space that Dragon Ball had explored with particular care, because the hybrid fighters, Gohan most centrally, but future Trunks and Goten as well, occupied a unique position in the story's power structure. They carried Saiyan genetics without being Saiyans, and that inheritance behaved differently in them than it did in their full-blooded counterparts. The series had hinted throughout the Frieza saga, the Android saga, and the Cell saga that hybrid Saiyans carried a depth of latent potential that exceeded what the standard Saiyan bloodline produced, not in terms of the ceiling of their ordinary development, but in terms of what could be unlocked when the right conditions were met. Gohan was the figure around whom this potential most visibly gathered, and his transformation history was one of the most emotionally dense in the entire series. The transformation that eventually received the official name Ultimate in Dragon Ball Super, called Mystic for years in informal discourse, a name that the official material eventually set aside, was the culmination of a process that had been building across multiple story arcs. Its origins stretched back to Namek, where Elder Guru had briefly sensed and opened the surface of Gohan's inner capability. The fuller development came much later, during the Buu saga, through the intervention of the Old Kai, a being so ancient that he had been sealed inside the Z-Sword for 15 generations before the sword was broken during Gohan's training. The Old Kai performed a ritual on Gohan that the series depicted at unusual length, emphasizing its pace, its patience, its deliberate slowness. The process took more than a full Earth day to complete, which made it the longest potential unlocking procedure shown anywhere in the series. Elder Guru's version on Namek had been nearly instantaneous. The ultra-divine water that Master Korin had once offered in the Piccolo Daimao arc had taken 6 hours to show its effects, though that substance operated through an entirely different mechanism. The Old Kai's method was something else, a ceremony that accumulated across time, drawing potential upward by degrees rather than all at once. What emerged from the ritual was a transformation that the series depicted with deliberate restraint. Gohan's hair stood upward without turning gold. His eyes shifted to the shape typically associated with Super Saiyan, narrow, determined. The pupil color changed, without taking on the green-blue tint that the Super Saiyan eye change normally produced. His ordinary expression was replaced by something quieter and more settled, as though the power had arranged itself inside him in a way that required no visible announcement. There was no crackling electricity, no golden aura pressing outward against the world. He simply became deeper. The capability this form represented placed it clearly above Super Saiyan 2. Measuring precisely how far above was complicated by the fact that Gohan's base form itself grew stronger through training in ways that made the comparison a moving target. But in the moment of the form's debut during the Buu saga, its effect on the combat situation was dramatic enough to establish it as a genuine leap. Dragon Ball GT handled the ultimate form in a way that differed from later interpretations. In that continuity, the form appeared to have become Gohan's constant state, rather than a discrete transformation. He simply walked around in it, his hair already in its upright position, his power already at that elevated baseline. He could further transform into Super Saiyan on top of it, producing a stacked configuration that no other presentation of the form had shown. Dragon Ball Super arriving later and operating in a different continuity, established the ultimate form clearly as a separate transformation, something Gohan entered and exited, above Super Saiyan 1 and 2, in a legible hierarchy, activated through its own specific mechanism rather than simply being a permanent state. The two treatments were not contradictions in any harmful sense, but different storytelling choices about the same underlying power approached through different creative lenses, separated by years of development. Beyond the ultimate form, as though the story needed to demonstrate that even the deepest unlocking had further depth below it, there was Beast Gohan. This transformation appeared in the Dragon Ball Super manga's treatment of the events dramatized in Dragon Ball Super Superhero, and it was given a precision of definition that the ultimate form had sometimes lacked in its earlier appearances. The Dragon Ball Super manga described Beast explicitly, not as a divine form in the manner of the god-aligned transformations developing on the Goku and Vegeta side of the story, and not as any variant of Super Saiyan, but as something specific to Gohan's nature as a being whose potential operated by rules that did not apply to anyone else. The form that emerged was visually striking in ways that had distinguished it clearly from everything that had come before. Gohan's hair turned silver and grew to an enormous length, sweeping upward into a form that recalled the most extreme Saiyan hair extensions while remaining its own thing. His eyes shifted to red, with visible pupils that gave them a kind of focused intensity. Even his eyebrows changed shape, a detail small enough that it might seem insignificant, but one that the series used to emphasize the completeness of the transformation rather than undermining it. In terms of capability, Beast Gohan was described by the manga as placing him in a range comparable to the most advanced forms available to Goku and Vegeta at that point in the story. A sparring session between Gohan and Goku revealed something further, a quality to the form that was not entirely under control. Gohan implied that drawing out the beast form's power to its full extent risked a kind of snapping, a loss of composure that the series did not fully explore in the material available at the time this story is told. It was a thread deliberately left open, a suggestion that the form's relationship to Gohan's inner life was more complex than the simple power enhancement that most transformations represented. Beast Gohan was an evolution of the ultimate form, the story made clear. But it was also something else, something that seemed to draw from a part of Gohan's psychology that the series had been circling since his first moment of extraordinary power as a child on Namek, when he had briefly surpassed everyone around him before settling back into himself and forgetting what that felt like. The hybrid transformation called Super Saiyan Rage occupied a different position in the catalog, not because it was more powerful or more visually dramatic, but because of how little the series ultimately chose to say about it. The form belonged exclusively to future Trunks, the young warrior from the alternate timeline that had been introduced during the Android saga of Dragon Ball Z, and who returned as an adult figure during Dragon Ball Super's arc involving Goku Black and the villainous Zamasu. Super Saiyan Rage was an anime-exclusive form, which meant that the manga, which often served as the more detailed and definitionally precise version of the story, did not weigh in on it. The form's visual presentation placed it in the Super Saiyan 2 family in terms of its general character. The electricity was present, the aura was charged, the hair stood in the shape associated with that particular level of Saiyan transformation. But there was an additional quality, a second aura, nested within the first, smaller and more concentrated, carrying a blue tint that immediately recalled the color associated with the god-aligned Super Saiyan forms that Goku and Vegeta had developed. Whether this visual detail was meant to be mechanically significant, to suggest that future Trunks had somehow incorporated or partially activated the blue key that defined the god-aligned states, was never formally confirmed. The series provided certain details that made quiet inference possible. In the episode where the form fully appeared for the first time, Trunks passed briefly through what looked like Super Saiyan Grade 3 during his transformation sequence, a form that had been used by Vegeta during the Cell saga as a power grade layered onto Super Saiyan. Whether this was an animation choice that carried meaning or simply a visual beat in the transformation sequence, the official material did not clarify. And Trunks himself had noted, during a sparring session with Vegeta earlier in that arc, the specific way Vegeta wrapped himself in blue energy, a detail that felt like deliberate foreshadowing of the blue-tinted quality that Super Saiyan Rage would display. It remained, in the most honest accounting, one of the gentler mysteries the series had left lying in the grass, inviting quiet speculation without demanding it. In the long lineage of Saiyan transformation, everything connects eventually to the Great Ape, the oldest form, the one from which so many branches of the Saiyan power tree grew. The Uzaru, as the Daizenshu material named it, was not something the Saiyans had developed through training or through emotional breakthrough. It was carried in their biology from birth, latent in the tale that every pure-blooded Saiyan was born with, waiting for the right atmospheric condition to activate it. That condition was moonlight, specifically the Blutz waves that moonlight emitted at a particular frequency and intensity. When a full moon was visible and a Saiyan's tail was intact, the Blutz wave absorption triggered a transformation so complete that the fighter's ordinary form was essentially replaced rather than enhanced. The body would grow to enormous scale, a great ape in outline, but something stranger and more powerful in nature, radiating enormous energy, capable of destruction that made individual combat almost irrelevant. The multiplication of power was tenfold according to official reference material. A fighter who could produce a given energy output in their base form would produce 10 times that output as a great ape. The cost for most Saiyans was consciousness. The transformation overwhelmed ordinary awareness in fighters who had not developed the mental discipline to retain their identity inside it. The great ape would rampage without strategy or restraint, following instinct and appetite rather than any tactical thought. This was why the Saiyans had been deployed as planetary pacifiers under Frieza's empire. They could be sent to a planet, allowed to transform under a convenient moon, and would destroy the target population essentially automatically, without requiring direction or oversight. The efficiency was terrible in its simplicity. Saiyans who had developed sufficient mental discipline could fight inside the great ape form with full awareness, directing its enormous power towards specific strategic objectives. Vegeta demonstrated this on Earth during the Saiyan saga, using an artificial moon device to trigger his transformation while retaining the tactical intelligence that made him a genuine commander rather than simply a biological weapon. The artificial moon, a technique the Saiyans had clearly developed as a practical workaround for combat situations where natural moonlight was not available, was itself a detail that spoke to the practical culture the Saiyan warrior race had built around their own biology. The tale that enabled the great ape form was a point of vulnerability that the series treated with consistent seriousness. Removing it immediately ended the transformation and returned the Saiyan to their base form, regardless of circumstances. This created a tactical target that skilled opponents could exploit. And it was the reason that multiple characters across the series had their tails removed, sometimes in combat, sometimes deliberately as a permanent measure. The relationship between Saiyans and their tails was not simple. The tail affected Kai in ways the series touched on, but did not fully explore. Full-blooded Saiyans who grew up on Earth without transforming, like Goku, experienced periods when their power was partially suppressed by the presence of the tail rather than enhanced by it. These were details that accumulated in the background of the story, suggesting a biology more complex than the series ever found occasion to map completely. In the fifth Dragon Ball Z film, Lord Slug, which told the story of a Namekian villain who had survived by living in space rather than seeking the Dragon Balls for immortality, there appeared a transformation that the series acknowledged without fully naming or explaining. During the climactic battle of that film, at a moment of extreme pressure, Goku entered a state that looked like Super Saiyan without completing the transition. His hair took on the rising quality associated with the form. The aura around him changed. The power output increased dramatically, but his hair remained dark rather than turning gold, which immediately distinguished what was happening from the established Super Saiyan transformation that had not yet appeared in the main storyline. It was a threshold moment, the edge of a door that had not yet been pushed fully open. Reference material produced for the Dragon Ball Z films acknowledged this state. sometimes calling it false Super Saiyan, without making definitive claims about its mechanism or its relationship to the full Super Saiyan form that Goku would first properly achieve on Namek in the main story. The form faded quickly, and Goku himself seemed only partially aware of having been in it. In retrospect, it read as the series' first visual statement that what would happen on Namek was already building, that the pressure and the potential were accumulating, waiting for the right moment of grief and rage to complete what was clearly already almost ready. And then there was Namek itself, and the moment that defined everything afterward. The first true Super Saiyan transformation was one of the most carefully prepared revelations in Dragon Ball's long history. The series had been moving toward it across hundreds of chapters and episodes, layering in references to a legendary warrior who had appeared only once in 1,000 years, hinting at a capability that exceeded anything the contemporary story had shown. The mythology surrounding it was ancient, even within the Dragon Ball universe. It was spoken of in hushed terms, treated as something almost impossible, a power level that the established fighters of the story had come to regard as a kind of ceiling on what a Saiyan could be. And then Krillin died at Frieza's hands on the surface of Namek, and everything changed. Goku's grief in that moment was not ordinary. It was deep and sudden and complete. The grief of someone who has been friends with another person since childhood, who has trained beside them and competed with them and trusted them across the full span of memory, suddenly confronted with their absence. That grief cracked something open. The change began immediately, visible in Goku's body and aura before it was fully formed, and when it resolved, the Super Saiyan transformation stood where nothing had stood before. The visual language the series chose for Super Saiyan was immediately comprehensible in a way that felt earned. Hair that had always been black turned gold, rising into a shape that was swept and wild and charged with the energy pressing through it. Eyes that had carried warmth and curiosity shifted to a blue-green that felt somehow more remote, still alive with intelligence, but filtered through a distance that had not been there before. The aura that surrounded the transformed fighter was golden and active, visually alive, pressing outward against the world around it in a way that made even stillness look like held motion. The Daisen Shu placed the power multiplication at 50. A fighter who achieved Super Saiyan became 50 times more powerful than they had been in their base form the moment before the transformation. The number was enormous, but the series made it feel earned by the extended preparation that preceded the demonstration. This was not a power that appeared casually or explained itself quickly. It arrived at the exact moment the story had spent years building toward. The emotional architecture of the Super Saiyan form, the requirement of extreme grief or rage to achieve it initially, was a consistent part of its presentation across the fighters who first reached it. Goku's was grief for Krillin. Vegeta's was wounded pride and accumulated rage, the humiliation of someone who had spent his entire life defining himself by his position in a hierarchy, suddenly confronted with the evidence that the hierarchy was wrong. Gohan's was protective fury of a particular intensity, the fury of a child watching the people around him be hurt and being unable to prevent it. Future Trunks had achieved it in his own timeline, under circumstances the series depicted as equally extreme. Each first transformation was a unique emotional event, shaped by the specific person and the specific circumstances, which gave the form a warmth of meaning that pure power scaling could not fully account for. The evolution of the Super Saiyan form into what came to be known as Full Power Super Saiyan, or the mastered version, was one of the quieter revolutions in Dragon Ball's history of transformations. Goku had recognized something during the Cell Saga that Vegeta had not yet accepted. The Super Saiyan transformation was not simply a power multiplier, it was an emotional state, and emotional states carried energy costs. Holding a transformation that required ongoing agitation and charge meant burning through stamina at a rate that was fine for short encounters, but unsustainable across extended combat or ordinary daily life. The solution he arrived at was conceptually simple and practically demanding. He and Gohan spent the better part of their year in the hyperbolic time chamber, living as Super Saiyans, training in the form, eating in it, sleeping in it, becoming so thoroughly familiar with its feel and weight that it ceased to require conscious maintenance. The transformation became natural, the way breathing is natural. What emerged from that year of inhabited familiarity was a Super Saiyan that looked subtly different from the emotionally charged version. The aura was smaller and more contained, not the explosive golden presence of the form in its initial expression, but something quieter, more settled. The power was identical. There was no reduction in output. What changed was the cost of holding it. A mastered Super Saiyan could maintain the form through a full battle and afterward without the stamina drain that would have accumulated otherwise. And there was a quality of calm in the eyes that the form did not typically carry. Not the charged, agitated focus of someone holding a transformation at an edge, but the settled awareness of someone who had made peace with where they were. It was the form that Goku chose to carry into the Cell games, and in retrospect, it demonstrated a principle the series would revisit many times afterward. The most sustainable power was not the most agitated, it was the most settled. The transformation most fully inhabited was more effective than the one most desperately gripped. The grades of Super Saiyan, the second and third grade variations that emerged from pushing beyond the base form without ascending to the next true level, were the series' demonstration that power had directions as well as heights. Super Saiyan Grade 2 was not a new transformation in the strictest sense. It was an enhancement of the existing one, a deliberate increase in power output achieved by pushing more ki into the muscles and the form simultaneously. The muscle mass increased noticeably, the aura intensified. The raw physical force available to the fighter grew in a way that was clearly legible in combat. Hits landed harder, resistance against incoming attacks was greater, and the presence of the fighter became more physically imposing. Future Trunks used this grade extensively during the Android saga, and it served him in encounters where strength was the primary currency of the exchange. Vegeta used it during the Cell saga, and with it was able to overwhelm Cell in his semi-perfect form, demonstrating the grade's utility while also setting up the situation that would lead to Cell's completion. Super Saiyan Grade 3 was where the trade-offs became impossible to ignore. The muscular expansion in this grade was so extreme that it bordered on the absurd, the body growing wide and dense to a degree that made ordinary mobility seem implausible. The power output was remarkable, genuinely astonishing in terms of its raw magnitude. Cell himself, observing Trunks in Grade 3 for the first time, was visibly impressed by the energy signature before making his diagnosis of the form's fatal problem. Speed had collapsed, not because the nervous system had slowed or because the fighter's reactions had diminished, but because the sheer mass of the transformed body prevented movement at the pace that the power level demanded. Cell's reading of the situation was precise and merciless. He identified that the gap between the power available inside Grade 3 and the ability to bring that power into contact with a moving, capable opponent made the grade effectively non-functional against him. Trunks acknowledged the flaw without a great deal of drama, which was itself a kind of quiet maturity, the willingness to abandon a form he had reached, recognizing that reaching it was not the same as it being useful. Grade 3 lingered in the series catalog as one of the examples the story used to teach, not that power was bad, but that power without the ability to apply it was a category of trap. Super Saiyan 2 arrived under a sky full of watching fighters, in an arena that had been constructed for a single purpose, in a moment that Gohan's father had quietly prepared for by declining to fight Cell himself. The series had been building Gohan's potential for years, pointing at it, hinting at its depth, showing glimpses, and then drawing back. The Cell games was the place where all of that accumulated potential finally had no more room to stay potential. The form was recognizable as Super Saiyan, and yet immediately distinct from it. The hair rose to more distinct points, sharper at the edges. The aura crackled with electricity, arcs of blue-white energy moving through the golden field at irregular intervals, giving the whole form a quality of instability that was not dangerous but awesome. The visual language of something that had been held in too long finally being allowed out. The power increase over Super Saiyan was significant, and the series treated it as such, making clear through the combat that followed that Gohan in Super Saiyan 2 was genuinely beyond what Cell could manage at equivalent power. The version of Super Saiyan 2 that Gohan carried was further amplified by whatever depth of latent potential his hybrid genetics provided. What the series had consistently suggested was one of the deepest natural reserves in the entire cast. The battle that followed was long and uneven, and ultimately required more than any single fighter's transformation could provide. But in the form itself, in the moment of its arrival, there was something the series treated with visible reverence. A child, and Gohan was still a child at that point, had become, in an instant of protective rage, something the universe had not seen in that configuration before. Goku would achieve Super Saiyan 2 later, and Vegeta as well, and the form would become more common as the series progressed. But the way the series staged its first appearance, the attention it paid to every detail of the transformation sequence, made clear that it understood what it was showing. Super Saiyan 3 arrived not in a battle, but in a demonstration. Goku revealing its existence to his sons Goten and young Trunks during the Buu saga, in a moment that served as much theatrical as tactical purpose. The transformation sequence itself was extended and deliberate, the series allowing it to unfold at a pace that made clear this was something to be witnessed rather than hurried through. The hair grew enormously long, falling past the waist in golden waves, wild in a way that none of the preceding Super Saiyan forms had been. The eyebrows disappeared, replaced by a more pronounced brow ridge that gave the face an ancient, primal quality, something that recalled the Great Ape lineage more directly than the polished Super Saiyan forms had. The aura generated by Super Saiyan 3 was immense, its presence detectable across enormous distances, its visual scale making everything around the transformed fighter seem small by comparison. The ground shook, the air trembled, even Buu, watching from a distance, registered what was arriving. The power of Super Saiyan 3 was placed clearly and substantially above Super Saiyan 2, and in the context of the Buu saga, it made the encounter between Goku and the original Majin Buu at least meaningful where it would otherwise have been overwhelmingly one-sided. The form's limitation was also introduced alongside its power in a way that the series had not done for earlier transformations. Super Saiyan 3 consumed energy at a rate that no preceding form had approached, burning through stamina even in a full-blooded Saiyan with considerable reserves. The form was not sustainable across extended combat, particularly for someone fighting in a ghostly or otherwise constrained state. Gotenks, the fusion of Goten and young Trunks, achieved Super Saiyan 3 at an age and development level that would have seemed impossible in the normal scaling of the series, which was itself a statement about what fusion could accomplish. But the fusion's inherent time limit combined with Super Saiyan 3's energy consumption created a double constraint that made the combination deeply unreliable despite its impressive peak output. Super Saiyan 3 was, in retrospect, the series' most direct statement about the relationship between power and cost, the most powerful thing available, but available only briefly, and at a price that made it a last resort rather than a dependable tool. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Dragon Ball GT introduced the Super Saiyan 4 transformation, and it occupied a specific and singular place in the imagination of those who had grown up with the series. Visually unlike any of the Super Saiyan forms that preceded it in the main lineage, it moved in a different direction entirely, not toward more golden hair and larger auras, but towards something rawer and more physical, something that reached back toward the Saiyan race's most ancient power, rather than forward toward refinement. The fighter's body would develop a covering of red fur across the chest, the fur of the Great Ape transformed and concentrated into a form that could be worn by a fully aware, fully functional individual. The hair would grow longer and darker than ordinary Saiyan hair, a deep shade that varied in representation across different materials, but consistently conveyed a departure from the golden aesthetic. The eyes would shift to a golden color with narrow pupils, giving the face an intensity that was different in quality from the charged look of the Super Saiyan grades. The path to Super Saiyan 4 ran through the Great Ape form, which made the transformation's visual heritage legible. The intermediate state was the golden Great Ape. The Great Ape achieved not through ordinary moonlight, but through a more intense energy source, producing a form that retained the enormous scale of the Great Ape, but added to it the power coloring of the Super Saiyan. With sufficient self-awareness and control inside the golden Great Ape, with enough of one's individual identity retained against the overwhelming instinctive pressure of that ancient form, the enormous power could be compressed back to a human scale. What emerged from that compression was Super Saiyan 4, the GT Perfect Files, the official supplemental publication produced to accompany Dragon Ball GT, described the form in terms that connected it explicitly to the Saiyan racial heritage. This was the form of a Saiyan who had fully integrated their ancient biological legacy with their developed individual identity, who had taken the power of the Great Ape and made it something that could be held and directed by a conscious mind. In terms of placement in the GT power hierarchy, Super Saiyan 4 was far above Super Saiyan 3, and the gap between them was treated as greater than the gap between the earlier levels. Gogeta's Super Saiyan 4 form reached when Goku and Vegeta performed the Metamoran fusion dance, while both in Super Saiyan 4 represented the apex of GT's power scale and the most extreme expression of the Super Saiyan 4 concept. The fusion combined the full power of both fighters in that form, creating a being whose capability exceeded what either could reach alone by the multiplicative logic of fusion. The visual character of Super Saiyan 4 Gogeta was the most elaborate expression of the form, with the fur and the dark hair and the golden eyes of the base Super Saiyan 4 configuration presented through the specific aesthetic of the fusion, something that felt complete rather than transitional, the end point rather than the middle of a development arc. Super Saiyan God was the form that opened the Dragon Ball Super era's approach to transformation, and its arrival reframed what the series was doing with power in a way that the preceding forms had not. The earlier Super Saiyan transformations, however many times multiplied, however elaborate in their visual presentation, had all been developments of the same underlying thing. They were Saiyan power in various configurations of intensity. Super Saiyan God introduced something qualitatively different, a category distinction rather than just a numerical one. The divine key that the form accessed was not simply more power, it was power of a different type, operating at a frequency that ordinary Kai-sense could not accurately read, creating a presence that felt different to other fighters in a way they could not always articulate clearly. The ritual that produced it required 6 Saiyans of pure heart, 5 of them channeling their ki into the 6th simultaneously, the accumulated divine quality of that combined offering transforming the recipient's power into something that matched the God ki tier. The appearance of Super Saiyan God was deliberately understated, which felt like a creative decision about what divine power looked like. The hair turned red, a calm, settled red rather than any shade that suggested agitation or urgency. The body became slightly slimmer, the power more compressed, the visual character of the form quieter than any Super Saiyan transformation that had preceded it. No crackling electricity, no explosive aura pressing against the world. Just a settled, deep power that looked almost casual to observers who did not understand what they were seeing. This was, in retrospect, exactly the right visual choice for a form that was meant to represent a qualitative elevation rather than a quantitative one. More was not necessarily more. The most refined thing was sometimes the most contained. After the encounter with Beerus, in which Goku held Super Saiyan God and then lost it and returned to his base state, something was retained. A residual impression of the divine ki had settled into his body, a memory of the form's quality that raised his baseline without giving him full access to the form itself. This residual divine influence meant that even Goku's ordinary fighting in later arcs carried within it a trace of what Super Saiyan God had introduced, a detail that the series used to explain certain performance levels that his base form achieved in later confrontations. Super Saiyan Blue, the full name being Super Saiyan God Super Saiyan, which the series sometimes abbreviated and sometimes did not, was the natural consequence of a Saiyan who had already accessed the divine ki of Super Saiyan God, choosing to further transform into the Super Saiyan state on top of that divine foundation. The multiplication of one power enhancement onto another produced a result that placed Super Saiyan Blue substantially above Super Saiyan God in terms of raw output. The visual identity of the form was blue hair, a shade that felt cool and composed compared to the heat and charge of the golden forms that dominated the earlier chapters of Super Saiyan history. The eyes matched the hair. The aura carried both the golden quality of the standard Super Saiyan transformation and the deeper, more settled texture of the divine ki, visible as a layered presence rather than a single unified output. In terms of the story it served, Super Saiyan Blue became the workhorse form of the Dragon Ball Super era, present across the Universe 6 arc, the Zamasu and Goku Black arc, and the Tournament of Power, used in situations ranging from serious competitive matches to desperate survival encounters. The combination of Super Saiyan Blue with the Kaioken technique was one of the more surprising developments the form enabled. The Kaioken was an old technique, one that Goku had developed under King Kai's training during the original Dragon Ball Z timeline, and that had not been used for many arcs by the time Super Saiyan Blue made its appearance. The Kaioken multiplied the user's power at the cost of extreme physical strain on the body. The technique demanded more than the body was normally capable of providing, and the damage accumulated quickly. Stacking Kaioken onto Super Saiyan had always been theoretically impossible because the emotional agitation required by Super Saiyan made the fine ki control that Kaioken demanded essentially unachievable. Super Saiyan Blue, with its divine ki foundation and the calm control that divine ki encouraged, solved that incompatibility. Goku demonstrated Kaioken times 20 stacked onto Super Saiyan Blue in his Tournament of Power battle against Hit, producing a power output that briefly exceeded anything he had otherwise shown in that arc. The cost was severe, and the form was not sustainable beyond the immediate encounter, but its existence demonstrated something important about how the divine ki of Super Saiyan Blue changed the practical toolkit available to its user. Super Saiyan Blue evolved was Vegeta's answer to the same question that had occupied his entire development arc across Dragon Ball Super: how to continue growing without following the same path as Goku. Vegeta and Goku had shared the Super Saiyan Blue form for most of the Super era, but Vegeta's evolution of it moved differently. Super Saiyan Blue evolved was not a new form accessed through a ritual or a divine gift. It was the result of Vegeta pushing the existing form further than it had been pushed before, finding within it a depth that ordinary training and combat had not yet reached. The visual marker was a deepening of the blue, the hair shifting to a richer, more saturated shade, the overall presence becoming more compressed and intense. The power increase was genuine, and the story acknowledged it directly, with Vegeta himself noting the change without ceremony, as was his way. The form appeared during the Tournament of Power in Vegeta's battle against Jiren, the overwhelmingly powerful fighter from Universe 11, who served as the arc's central challenge. It was not enough to defeat Jiren, nothing on Vegeta's side of the encounter was, but it was enough to land meaningful blows and to push the encounter into territory that the standard form could not have reached. The legendary Super Saiyan category represented a branch of the Saiyan transformation lineage that operated by different rules from the main line. In the non-canonical Dragon Ball Z films, specifically the 8th film, Broly, the legendary Super Saiyan, and its sequel, the form had appeared for the first time, applied to a Saiyan named Broly, whose extraordinary power had made him an object of fear even in infancy. The legendary Super Saiyan form in those films was enormous in presentation, the muscle mass expanding dramatically, the hair turning green-tinted rather than the standard gold, the scale of the physical form growing in ways that recalled Grade 3, without its speed penalty. The power was depicted as essentially boundless within the context of each film, rising continuously through the encounter rather than establishing a fixed level at the outset. When Dragon Ball Super, Broly brought Broly into the canonical continuity as an official character with the full weight of Toriyama's creative involvement, the legendary Super Saiyan concept traveled with him but received more careful treatment. The Broly of Dragon Ball Super Broly did not present a single discrete legendary Super Saiyan form, but rather a progression, power that built continuously through the course of the battle, moving through visible stages of increasing intensity without clear stopping points. He began in a form that the story described as his base Great Ape power, compressed into humanoid size, then progressed through a controlled Super Saiyan state, then into the full release of his legendary power. The continuously growing quality of the legendary form was the detail the film emphasized most consistently. The sense that the ceiling was not visible, that whatever Broly had shown was not necessarily the maximum he was capable of. The trigger for the full legendary release was emotional rather than disciplined. The rage and grief of seeing his companion threatened was what drove the final expression, giving the form the same emotional foundation that the original Super Saiyan transformation had operated on, but with far less control over the result. Kale, the quiet and shy Saiyan from Universe 6 who appeared during the Tournament of Power arc, carried her own version of the legendary Super Saiyan transformation, and her story around it was one of the Tournament of Power's more quietly touching details. Kale's legendary state emerged first as an overwhelming surge she could not direct or contain, driving her into a rampage that she herself was frightened of. With encouragement from her partner Caulifla, the confident and naturally gifted Universe 6 Saiyan who had achieved Super Saiyan and Super Saiyan 2 with remarkable ease, Kale found a way to settle into the legendary form's power rather than being swept away by it. The controlled version of her legendary Super Saiyan state was visually distinguished from the gold standard by its green aura, a shade that immediately recalled Broly's presentation and established the forms as belonging to the same category. In terms of power, controlled Kale was formidable enough to be a meaningful participant in the tournament's most intense confrontations. The Potara fusion of Kale and Caulifla produced Kefla, and Kefla's Super Saiyan forms were the most extreme expression of what those two fighters could achieve through combination. The fusion brought together Caulifla's natural talent and rapid development. She had achieved Super Saiyan and Super Saiyan 2 with a speed that astonished observers, with the depth of Kale's legendary potential. Kefla's Super Saiyan and Super Saiyan 2 forms were presented as genuinely threatening to Goku, even in Ultra Instinct Sign, placing them in a power range that neither component fighter would have approached alone. The fusion's advantage was not simply additive, it was multiplicative, as the Potara fusion always was, producing a fighter whose capability exceeded the sum of her components. Frieza's transformation history worked on a principle that the series spent considerable time explaining because it was counterintuitive. Frieza did not transform to become more powerful in the ordinary sense. He transformed to suppress power that was otherwise too great for practical daily management. His natural capability was so enormous that maintaining it constantly would have been as impractical as carrying a mountain everywhere one went. The forms he occupied were biological containment shells, each one holding back a portion of his true capability, allowing him to function at a scale appropriate to whatever situation he found himself in without the full weight of his energy being continuously present. This meant that each transformation downward through his suppression shells produced more power, not less, a reversal of the ordinary transformation logic that the series used to make the Frieza saga's revelation of his final form particularly impactful. The form most audiences first encountered on Namek was Frieza's first suppression configuration, horned, smooth, visually elegant in a cold way that matched his personality. Even at this most suppressed level, he could destroy planetary bodies at will, which established immediately that the concept of power being talked about in this arc was on a different scale from anything the series had previously engaged with. The second form was larger and more muscular, carrying a more aggressively physical quality. It was the form Frieza used in his initial significant engagement with Piccolo on Namek, and the power increase over the first form was substantial enough to make the encounter feel immediately serious. The third form was the most unusual aesthetically: elongated skull, proportions that moved away from humanoid towards something deeply alien, a form that seemed to value the intimidation of its appearance as much as the power it represented. It was brief in its appearance within the story, a waypoint rather than a destination, and its most lasting contribution was the suspense it created by establishing that one further form remained. The final form, sometimes called the true form or simply the fourth form, was the great revelation of the Frieza saga, and the series staged its arrival with appropriate deliberateness. Compact, smooth, white and purple in coloring, carrying an almost architectural elegance that contradicted the brute energy contained within it, Frieza's final form looked least threatening of all and was most dangerous. The power increase from the third form to the final form was the greatest of the sequence, and the series made this clear through the effect the form had on the combat situation immediately. It was in this form that Frieza fought Goku for the arc's full climax, in this form that he destroyed Namek's core, in this form that he measured every significant antagonist and power level the series would discuss for years afterward. Golden Frieza arrived in Dragon Ball Z, Resurrection F, and in Dragon Ball Super's treatment of those events, and the form represented something philosophically interesting in the series' transformation catalog. Frieza had never needed to train in his life. His natural capability had always been sufficient for anything he encountered, and the culture and practices that had made Saiyan fighters progressively stronger through disciplined effort had never been part of his experience. Golden Frieza was what happened when he finally applied that same principle. 4 months of intensive training, which was simultaneously brief by any serious standard, and an eternity for someone who had never done anything like it before. The result of those 4 months was a transformation that shifted his coloring from white and purple to gold, a shade that carried immediate visual echoes of the Super Saiyan transformation. At peak performance, Golden Frieza's capability exceeded Super Saiyan Blue, which represented an extraordinary achievement for a fighter who had been relying on raw natural talent for his entire existence and had only recently encountered the concept of development through effort. The form's limitation was stamina, specifically, the adaptation that Frieza's body had not yet completed. Golden Frieza was new, and the body had not learned to maintain it efficiently. The energy drain was severe enough that sustained combat would erode the form's advantage in ways that a more seasoned transformation would not have experienced. This was the detail that determined the outcome of the resurrection event, and it was a lesson the series had taught before in different registers. Grade 3 Super Saiyan being the most direct precedent. Power that could not be sustained was power that could only be borrowed. Black Frieza, the transformation that appeared later in the Dragon Ball Super manga after another sustained period of training in a temporal chamber that accelerated the passage of time, represented the completion of what Golden Frieza had begun. The coloring shifted once more to a deep black that carried more gravity than the gold and white of previous forms. The power it represented was placed above both Ultra Ego Vegeta and True Ultra Instinct Goku simultaneously, a statement about what patient, sustained development could accomplish, arriving late but arriving with finality. The creation and transformation history of Cell was a story of deliberate biological engineering, a being designed from the cellular material of the strongest fighters the world had produced, assembled by a scientist who had spent decades studying power and building toward its artificial reconstruction. Dr. Gero's final project was intended to be the most capable fighter ever created, and the transformations Cell underwent were part of the design, not incidental features of his biology. Cell's initial, imperfect state presented him as recognizably biological, but incomplete. His physical form carrying an insectoid quality that suggested something not yet fully resolved, a creature that had not yet become what it was ultimately intended to be. His ability to absorb humans and drain their energy was the mechanism through which he built his power in this phase, moving from target to target systematically, growing with each absorption. The absorption of Android 17 was the form-changing event in Cell's progression, the threshold from the imperfect state to the semi-perfect. The change was significant in multiple dimensions. Physically, Cell became more humanoid, the insectoid quality receding as the integration of 17's cellular material changed his biology. Power increased substantially, placing him well above what he had been capable of before. But the semi-perfect form was not the intended destination. Cell's design had been oriented from the beginning toward a third configuration, the perfect form, that required the specific addition of Android 18 to complete. The situation during the Cell saga that allowed 18 to be absorbed was itself one of the defining moments in Vegeta's character arc, his pride and curiosity overriding his tactical judgment, creating the opening Cell needed, producing consequences that the story would spend the remainder of the arc working through. Perfect Cell was the most visually refined of all Cell's configurations, compact, humanoid, carrying an almost architectural elegance that the insectoid forms had not. The power represented by the perfect form was presented as the greatest available to a single fighter at that point in the main storyline, which was itself a statement about what the cellular combination of Goku, Gohan, Piccolo, Vegeta, Trunks, Frieza, and King Cold could produce when assembled and integrated through the specific biological engineering Garo had spent his life developing. The Cell games that followed, Perfect Cell's open invitation to Earth's strongest fighters, was staged as a demonstration of what the perfect form was and meant, a showcase that turned into something more complicated when Gohan's Super Saiyan 2 power arrived to complicate the equations Cell had run. Super Perfect Cell emerged from the aftermath of Cell's self-destruction and regeneration, the Saiyan DNA incorporated into his design, enabling a Zenkai-like boost from near-death experience. Pushing his power above the original perfect form ceiling, this final configuration drove the arc's ultimate confrontation, and it met its end through a combination that no single transformation or fighter could have provided alone. The story of Majin Buu was itself a story of transformation, repeated and layered across multiple configurations, each one emerging from the specific dynamics of the creature's encounters with the world around it. The original Majin Buu, round and pink with an appearance that suggested childhood or innocence more than the ancient and terrible entity it actually was, carried within it a tension that the series established early and resolved slowly. This was a being of millions of years old, an entity that had once been directed by the wizard BBD in a campaign of destruction across the universe, that had been sealed and unsealed, that had experienced enough over its long existence to develop something resembling kindness, without entirely leaving behind the destruction that had originally defined it. The power represented by this original form was placed above Super Saiyan 3 Goku by the story's later assessments. Not dramatically, but consistently enough to establish that the Z fighters were not in a position to simply overpower the situation. The division of Majin Buu into his two constituent natures, the kind expression and the evil expression separating into distinct physical entities, was one of the more conceptually unusual developments in Dragon Ball's transformation history. It was not an absorption or a power increase, but a splitting, the reverse of a fusion, a being becoming two, where there had been one. The evil Buu that emerged from this division was gray rather than pink, thin rather than round, and stronger than the good Buu that remained, a detail that said something about the relative strength of the two natures even before the confrontation between them resolved. Evil Buu's absorption of good Buu, converting the kinder half into chocolate and consuming it in the one instance where Buu's absorption operated through eating rather than the usual envelopment, produced Super Buu. The resulting form combined Evil Buu's dominant personality with a body configuration better suited to sustained combat, and Piccolo's assessment was precise. Super Buu exceeded the original Majin Buu in every meaningful capability. The absorptions that Super Buu performed across the subsequent arc each produced slight changes in his physical appearance, the clothing and features shifting toward whatever had been absorbed most recently, a visual shorthand for the integration of each new element. Piccolo's absorption added strategic intelligence, making Super Buu a more tactically dangerous opponent than he had been when operating on pure destructive instinct. The absorption of Gotenks added the enormous power of the fusion in its Super Saiyan 3 configuration, creating what was sometimes called Buu-Tenks, a form that combined Buu's extraordinary durability and regeneration with the extreme power output of Gotenks at his peak. The absorption of Gohan, Ultimate Gohan, at the form's full depth, produced what was sometimes called Buuhan, the most powerful configuration of Super Buu, a form that the story presented as the greatest single threat the Buu saga generated. The removal of the absorbed fighters through the intervention of the portal technique pulled these forms away one by one, and what remained at the end of that extraction process was something unexpected. Kid Buu, the form that emerged when all the absorbed personalities had been removed and only the original ancient core remained, was not a further evolution but a reduction. It was Majin Buu in his most essential state, stripped of everything that the absorptions had added: the intelligence, the physical bulk, the power modulations that the various absorbed beings had contributed. What remained was small by Buu standards, pink and disturbingly powerful in a way that had nothing to do with refined technique or strategic thinking. Kid Buu's power was estimated differently across different reference materials, but the series' presentation placed him as a uniquely dangerous opponent, not necessarily because he was the most powerful thing available, but because he was the most purely chaotic, willing to destroy himself along with everything else, with no instinct towards self-preservation that could be exploited as a strategic weakness. The muscular Buu form, sometimes called Buff Buu or Super Buff Buu in various reference traditions, occupied a historical position in the Majin Buu timeline that the main story addressed primarily through flashback. This was the configuration Buu had occupied after absorbing the South Supreme Kai in the ancient period of his initial rampage, before the subsequent absorption of the Grand Supreme Kai had introduced enough of that gentler god's nature to reshape Buu toward the rounder, softer configuration of the original Majin Buu that the story's present-day events began with. The South Supreme Kai had been an enormously muscular figure, one of the governing deities of Universe 7, and his absorption had pushed Buu into a large-bodied, heavily muscular state that was stronger than the original Majin Buu, but weaker than many of the forms Buu would subsequently develop through further absorptions. It was one of those transformation details that lived primarily in the lore rather than the drama, present in the record, quiet in the memory. The fusion transformations of Dragon Ball occupied a category that was not quite transformation in the individual sense, and yet produced changes so complete and so dramatic that they belonged in any serious catalog of what Dragon Ball's fighters could become. The Metamoran fusion dance, the technique developed by the fighters of the Metamoran race, demonstrated by Goku and taught to Goten and young Trunks, required two fighters of nearly identical build and power to perform a precise sequence of mirrored movements, concluding in a specific contact at the fingertips, with the word fusion spoken at the exact right moment. The result was a new being, not a merger in the ordinary sense, but something that felt like a genuine third identity, its own name, its own personality, its own slightly bemused awareness of having arrived from two directions simultaneously. The limitation was time, approximately 30 minutes in base form, less under the stamina pressure of more powerful transformations. Gotenks, the fusion of Goten and young Trunks, was perhaps the most memorable demonstration of what the fusion dance could produce at the junction of youth and extraordinary natural talent. His personality was theatrical and impulsive in a way that neither component expressed alone, and his power was genuinely remarkable for two fighters of their age and development. Achieving Super Saiyan 3 inside a fusion with the time limits the dance imposed was an extraordinary result, and the series treated it as such while also making clear the practical problems that combination created. Gogeta, the fusion of Goku and Vegeta, appeared in Dragon Ball GT as the counter to Omega Shenron and was later fully canonized through Dragon Ball Super Broly, where he appeared in Super Saiyan Blue form. The Gogeta of the Broly film was one of the most complete expressions of what Saiyan fusion could achieve, combining two of the universe's most powerful fighters in their most advanced available form with a personality that felt light and confident rather than burdened. The Potara fusion, achieved through earrings created by the Supreme Kais and worn on opposite ears by the two participants, was initially presented as permanent for ordinary mortals, a merger that would last indefinitely unlike the dance's 30-minute window. Later story developments established that Potara fusion, when performed by non-deities, would expire after approximately 1 hour. Vegito, the Potara fusion of Goku and Vegeta, appeared twice in the main story arc. During the Buu saga, Vegito's power was presented as the most extreme counter available to the Buuhan configuration, a fighter of such substantial capability that the story had to find other mechanisms to complicate his path to victory. During the Future Trunks arc of Dragon Ball Super, Vegito appeared again in Super Saiyan Blue form, and the fusion's power in that configuration was presented as enormous even by the standards of what the series had established in the Super era. The 1-hour limit ultimately proved a decisive constraint in that appearance, the fusion expiring at a moment of tactical inconvenience that shaped the arc's conclusion. Dragon Ball GT's landscape of transformations extended beyond the main Saiyan lineage into territory the series used to explore what happened to the Saiyan heritage when filtered through very different circumstances and very different kinds of beings. Baby, the parasitic Sulfurian intelligence whose people had been destroyed by the Saiyans generations before the main story's events, represented a transformation type that operated through possession and accumulation rather than individual development. Baby's survival had been engineered through a form that allowed him to enter and gradually take control of hosts, eventually seeking the most powerful Saiyan body available as his preferred vessel. In Vegeta's body, Baby progressed through a series of power states that paralleled the Saiyan transformation system, while carrying Sulfurian aesthetic modifications. The white hair rather than gold, the biological armor that grew from the body's surface, the blue eyes that stayed constant through the transformations. The GT Perfect files connected Baby Vegeta's most extreme form to Super Saiyan 3 in terms of developmental parallel, a form that, starting from Super Saiyan as the baseline, had moved through 2 further stages of enhancement. General Rildo, the machine mutant commander who served the machine planet M2, brought his own transformation pair to GT's catalog. His hyper-meta form was achieved after merging with the remains of the Sigma Force, the elite unit that served under him. The integration added armor and equipment to his already mechanically enhanced body, including a drill arm, and pushed his power to a level sufficient to compete with Super Saiyan Goku in a meaningful way. His metal form was something different, not a power increase in the conventional sense, but an expansion of capability into a new domain. In metal form, Rildo could exercise total control over all metallic material in his environment, including the entire substance of the machine planet itself. This made the planet itself an extension of his body, and his combat toolkit a mode of combat that had no close parallel elsewhere in the series. The Shadow Dragons of Dragon Ball GT were perhaps the most philosophically rich antagonists the series had generated, because their existence was a consequence of the protagonist's own choices, specifically of the repeated use of the Dragon Balls across decades of story without considering the accumulated cost. Each wish made to Shenron deposited negative energy into the Dragon Ball used to make it, and that energy had been accumulating across all 7 balls for years. When the accumulation reached its limit, the 7 Shadow Dragons emerged, 1 from each ball, each carrying the negative energy of specific wishes made with that ball. Their individual transformation histories were as varied as their origins. Chi Shenron, Naturon Shenron, demonstrated a Buu-like absorption capability, taking in other beings and shifting form to reflect what had been absorbed. The mole-like initial form gave way to a more powerful configuration after absorbing Pan, incorporating her energy and capabilities into a stronger presentation. Oceanus Shenron maintained a humanoid princess form used for deception, alongside her true state, a transformation of appearance used as a social manipulation tool rather than a combat enhancement. Sin Shenron, the dragon born from the negative energy of the wish that had originally revived Goku, was the most powerful of the 7 in his base form. His absorption of the remaining 6 Dragon Balls, reclaiming all 7 concentrated sources of negative energy, produced Omega Shenron, a transformation that pushed his power above Super Saiyan 4 Goku and established him as a threat that required the most extreme fusion form available to address. In the Dragon Ball Super manga, Morrow introduced a transformation category that the main story had not previously encountered, change driven not by key development or emotional breakthrough, but by consumption and copying. By taking from the world around him rather than developing within himself. Morrow was an ancient sorcerer whose power was magical in nature, and his ability to drain ki from living beings and from planets themselves gave him a means of enhancement that bypassed ordinary development paths entirely. His absorption of Android 73, itself a being capable of temporarily copying the abilities of those it absorbed, was the pivotal transformation event in Morrow's arc. The integration of 73 into his own being made that copying ability permanent, and it added all of the specific techniques that 73 had accumulated before the absorption as permanent parts of Morrow's repertoire. The physical change was significant. Morrow shifted toward a more humanoid appearance, his goat-like features receding, his form becoming something closer to a recognizable bipedal being. The subsequent copying of the angel Maris's divine powers produced Angel Morrow, a form whose visual shift toward white and whose access to Ultra Instinct placed it in a category of power the arc had not previously reached. But the angel power was inherently destabilizing in a mortal vessel. Angels existed at a level of existence that ordinary biological frameworks were not designed to contain. The instability drove Morrow's transformation further into the configuration called Planet Morrow, a merger with the Earth itself, the planet becoming his body in order to distribute the divine energy across a scale that a single biological form could not hold. In this state, the concept of individual combat became essentially irrelevant, because the opponent had become the ground beneath the fighter's feet. The solution the story produced was specific to Goku's development of Ultra Instinct, a technique applied in a way that identified and reached Morrow's unique point of vulnerability amid a situation that ordinary combat logic could not address. Ultra Instinct had been described long before it was achieved. Whis had articulated its principle during training sessions with Goku and Vegeta in the years of relative peace before the Tournament of Power arc. The ideal fighting state was one in which the body moved without waiting for the mind to form an intention, where reaction and adjustment happened below the level of conscious thought, where the gap between stimulus and response, that strategy and decision-making usually occupied, had been closed entirely. For most fighters, this was aspirational in a way that felt more philosophical than practical. For the gods and angels who operated at that tier of existence, it was simply how they moved. The first expression of Ultra Instinct in Goku, the sign form, the incomplete form, arrived during the Tournament of Power in a moment of extraordinary pressure, breaking through in the same way that other breakthroughs in the series had, at the far edge of what was bearable. His hair took on a dark, silver-tinted quality. A distinctive aura appeared that felt qualitatively different from all the forms that had preceded it, not larger or more charged, but different in texture, different in the quality of its presence. The defensive aspect of Ultra Instinct's sign was what distinguished it most clearly. Goku's ability to dodge and evade in this form reached a level that Jiren, the most powerful fighter in the Tournament of Power, operating at his full output, could not meaningfully penetrate. Attacks that should have connected passed through the space Goku had already left, the body having moved before any conscious command had been issued. The incomplete nature of the form was its limitation. Sign covered the reactive and defensive dimensions of the Ultra Instinct technique, but had not extended fully into offense. The completed form's arrival was marked by the silver hair that the series had used in promotional material long before the story reached it. Silver, settled, composed, the visual language of something fully resolved rather than still arriving. In the silver form, both offense and defense operated through the same instinctive subconscious logic. The body acted because it needed to act, without the delay of decision. The full combat capability of the form was demonstrated in the exchanges with Jiren that followed, and it was there that the Tournament of Power's power scale found its effective ceiling. The distinction between the two Ultra Instinct states became practically significant in the stories that followed the Tournament of Power. During the Granola arc, Goku discovered that Ultra Instinct Saiyan, the dark-haired incomplete form, could be used with emotions active and integrated rather than quieted and removed. The original presentation of Ultra Instinct had emphasized the quieting of emotional interference as a condition for the form's function. But Goku found that his emotions, when inhabited rather than suppressed, provided their own dimension of power within the form. His emotional nature, the care for the people around him, the loyalty and warmth that had defined his character across the full length of the series, became, in this reading, not an obstacle to the technique but a source of it, integrated rather than overcome. Toyotaro confirmed in interviews that the official count of Ultra Instinct forms was 2, the dark-haired Saiyan and the silver-haired Completion, and that no additional formal designation existed beyond these 2 official states. Toppo's transformation into what the series presented as a god of destruction level state was one of the Tournament of Power's most significant revelations, because it disclosed something about Toppo himself that the story had been positioning throughout his appearances. He was a candidate to succeed Belmod as the god of destruction of Universe 11, a status he had clearly reached through extraordinary power and sufficient qualification in the eyes of the divine hierarchy. Committing fully to that identity during the tournament, abandoning the hero philosophy that had defined his entire life in order to access the destruction energy that the candidacy had given him, produced a physical transformation that the series marked visually with precision. His body grew larger and more muscular, his skin darkened, his eyes shifted to purple, the color consistently associated with destruction energy across the series' depictions of the gods of destruction. A symbol appeared on his torso, matching the marks worn on the uniforms of active gods of destruction throughout the universes. The access to Hakai, the technique of destruction that could erase things from existence, made him a particularly dangerous combatant in the context of the tournament, where a single successful application could eliminate a fighter entirely. What ended Toppo's participation was not the form's limitation, but Vegeta's willingness to absorb enormous punishment in order to land a decisive blow. Ultra Ego was Vegeta's final answer, the culmination of the path he had been walking since his first encounter with Beerus's destruction energy, and the form that felt most completely like Vegeta as a character had been distilled into a power state. The form was not about calm or technique or the quieting of the self. It was about the opposite, about leaning into the battle spirit that had always been Vegeta's most defining characteristic, and discovering that spirit was itself a mechanical advantage rather than simply a personality trait. Ultra Ego grew stronger the more engaged Vegeta was, and in some circumstances, absorbing damage could deepen the engagement rather than diminish it, adding fuel rather than taking it away. The visual identity was striking in its specificity. Purple hair, a shade that had no precedent in the Saiyan transformation palette, belonging to something new. The eyebrows disappeared as they had in Super Saiyan 3, replaced by the heavier brow. The eyes became pinkish-purple, with visible pupils. The destruction energy aura gave the form a quality different from anything in the ki-based transformation lineage. It felt raw, aggressive, present in a way that left no space for the kind of meditative refinement that Ultra Instinct suggested. This was Vegeta's form in a way that Super Saiyan Blue had not quite been, something shaped entirely by what he was, rather than by what he had borrowed or been given. And across all of these transformations, across the entire long catalog from the Wolfman form to Ultra Ego, from Max Power to Beast Gohan, from Great Ape to Omega Shenron, there ran a single thread that was easy to miss if one moved through them quickly. Each transformation was a question. What does this fighter become when they are pushed to the edge of what they currently are and find that the edge is not the end? The Wolfman transformation asked it of ordinary humans and found only modest answers. The Great Ape asked it of Saiyan biology and found something enormous and uncontrollable. The Super Saiyan forms asked it of Saiyan will and found gold and electricity and endless ascending grades. The divine forms asked it of the gap between what Saiyans were and what the gods already inhabited, and found that gap could be crossed with enough effort and enough grace. Each answer raised the next question, and the next transformation was always, somewhere, being prepared. What made Dragon Ball's transformation history remarkable, when followed slowly at the pace that sleep and quiet allow, was not the numbers associated with each form, it was the variety of philosophies the series explored through them. Some transformations required grief, some required calm, some required the complete abandonment of one kind of self in order to access another kind. Some were gifts, some were engineered, some were the biological heritage of a species, some were rituals requiring the cooperation of others, some were the result of centuries of patient effort applied without certainty of outcome. The series never settled on a single answer to the question of where power came from, and that refusal to settle was one of the things that kept the question interesting across decades. Goku's transformation history alone traced almost the entire arc of what the series came to understand about power. He began with the Great Ape, a form he could not control and whose activation he could not remember. He found Super Saiyan through grief and reached its mastered form through patience and familiarity. He pushed into Super Saiyan 2 and Super Saiyan 3, finding their costs even as he demonstrated their heights. He received Super Saiyan God through ritual and retained its residual impression as a permanent change to his baseline. He developed Super Saiyan Blue through the combination of that divine foundation with his existing Super Saiyan capability. He stacked the Kaioken onto Blue in a way that had seemed impossible before the divine key made it manageable. He reached Ultra Instinct Sign in a moment of extremity and resolved it toward the completed silver form through a battle that tested everything he had become. And then he discovered that his emotional nature was not an obstacle to the technique, but a part of it. That the Ultra Instinct Sign, inhabited with emotion rather than despite it, was its own valid expression of what he was. Vegeta's transformation history ran parallel and perpendicular simultaneously. He arrived as an elite Saiyan whose pride in his heritage defined his entire sense of self, entered Super Saiyan through wounded dignity rather than grief, competed with Goku for each subsequent level while finding his own relationship to each one. Super Saiyan Blue Evolved was his answer to the question of how to develop within a form rather than through a new one. Ultra Ego was his answer to the question of what happened when a fighter stopped trying to transcend their nature and simply inhabited it completely, when the battle spirit that had always been there became the engine rather than the fuel. Vegeta did not want to be like Goku. He never had, and the transformations the series gave him ultimately honored that refusal, finding for him a path that was genuinely his own rather than a variation on someone else's. Gohan's transformation history was the most emotionally textured of the three primary fighters' arcs because it was built around the theme of potential that was present but not always active, power that existed in depth but required specific conditions to surface. The child who briefly surpassed everyone on Namek, the teenager who broke through to Super Saiyan 2 against Cell, the young man whose ultimate form was unlocked through the old Kai's patient ritual, the father whose beast form suggested depths that even the ultimate unlock had not fully reached. Each of these was the same person at different stages of the same question. What could Gohan become when the right circumstances met the right moment? The series had spent decades developing that question, and as of the time this story is told, it had not yet finished answering it. Piccolo's transformation history told yet a different story, the story of a being who began as two halves and spent decades learning what it meant to be whole, and whose final transformation form was a gift from a dragon whose creation had originally come from the half of himself he had only recently reintegrated. Orange Piccolo was, in that reading, not simply a power enhancement, but a restoration, something that had been part of Kami, returning to Piccolo. Something that had been separated returning to the one who had always carried both sides of the original. The Ajisa tree mark on his back seemed to say as much. This is where you came from, and this power belongs to you. The transformation catalog of Dragon Ball was not finished when this quiet journey through it concluded. Somewhere in the ongoing production of the series, a creative team was still asking the same question it had always asked. What can this character become that they have not yet been? What is on the other side of the next threshold? What does a being look like when pushed to the absolute limit of what they are, and then pushed a little further? The answer would come in another form, another color, another visual language that the series had not yet found occasion to use. And when it did, it would be part of the same sentence that began with a Wolfman on a moonlit tournament stage decades ago, before anyone knew what was coming. There was a gentleness in that continuity if you followed it at the right pace. Every transformation was its own small story of becoming, a moment when something that had been impossible became real. When a fighter reached across the gap between what they were and what they needed to be and found their hand on the other side. The series had always been, at its deepest level, about that reaching, about the belief that the next thing was always possible, even when the present thing already seemed like everything, about the space between a Saiyan fighter in their ordinary form and the light that surrounds them when they step across the threshold. That space was small in time and enormous in meaning, and the series had been illuminating it, quietly and persistently, for as long as it had existed. There were other transformation details that the catalog held quietly, details that did not always receive the same emphasis as the major forms, but that contributed to the full texture of Dragon Ball's transformation history in ways that deserved a moment of attention before the story closed. The Kaioken was not, in the strictest sense, a transformation. It did not change the fighter's appearance in the dramatic ways that the Super Saiyan grades and divine forms did not alter the color of the hair or the quality of the aura in ways that announced a categorically new state, but it changed the body in a real and meaningful way, multiplying the output of ki through an act of will that forced the physical form past its ordinary limits. King Kai had developed the technique during his own long years of study, and it was one of the first power amplification methods Goku learned after his death and training under that quiet instructor's guidance in the period between the Saiyan saga's earlier events and his battle with Vegeta on Earth. The Kaioken could be stacked in multiples, Kaioken times 2, times 3, times 4 and higher, each multiple pushing further past what the body was designed to sustain, each multiple increasing both the power output and the physical cost. The technique left the user in a damaged state after its release, the body having been pushed through a range of output it was not built for. It had a particular gentleness in the name that belied its violence. The Kaioken, the Fist of the World King, described something astronomical in its cost, with the name of a technique that sounded almost ceremonial. The androids produced by Dr. Gero represented a different approach to transformation altogether, not biological development or emotional breakthrough, but mechanical engineering applied to the question of what a body was capable of. Android 16 was a pure mechanical creation, without the biological components that made some of the other androids more complex. Androids 17 and 18 were human beings whose bodies had been modified by Gero's research, the original biological infrastructure remaining while layers of mechanical enhancement had been added. Their power in ordinary operation already exceeded what most fighters could produce through years of development. Cell, drawing their specific biological signatures into his absorptive design, was using Gero's work against the components Gero had originally intended as part of a greater whole. Android 19 and 20, the latter being Gero himself in his android body, used an energy absorption system rather than the biological approach. Their transformation mechanism was the absorbed ki of opponents, which could be drained through physical contact and converted into their own power output. This made them dangerous against ki-based fighters in a specific way, though it also created a specific vulnerability in the case of opponents who fought primarily with physical force rather than projected energy. The transformation history of Super 17, one of the most consequential forms Dragon Ball GT introduced, deserved a slightly more detailed tracing of its origin. The plan behind Super 17 had been developed across two separate creative intelligences: Dr. Gero, whose obsession with defeating Goku had driven his entire career and whose ghost haunted the GT storyline through the android creations he left behind, and Dr. Mew, the machine mutant scientist whose interests aligned with Jero's in this particular goal. The construction of a new Android 17, built in Hell, assembled from the machine mutant technology that defined Mew's domain, was the first step. The second was manipulating the original Android 17, still living on Earth, into resonating with his duplicate and opening a portal through which Mew's constructs could cross over. The fusion of the two 17s was the transformation event itself, two beings of identical original template, merging into a single configuration whose power exceeded what either had been capable of individually. The absorption capability that Super 17 demonstrated against key attacks was the feature the story emphasized as most defining. It made conventional energy-based combat essentially self-defeating, every ki blast fired at him becoming fuel for the opponent rather than damage to him. The solution Goku eventually found was specific to the circumstances. The Dragon Fist technique, a physical blow of sufficient magnitude, combined with the Kamehameha at the exact moment when an internal conflict within 17 created the opening needed to bypass the absorption defense. Something should also be said about the role that the Dragon Balls themselves played in transformation history, not the Dragon Balls as a device for undoing damage or making wishes, but the Dragon Balls as a source of transformation in a more direct sense. The wishes made to Shenron had, at various points, been the mechanism through which transformation-related events had been initiated. The ritual that created Super Saiyan God had used the Dragon Balls to allow Shenron to confirm the process. Orange Piccolo had been directly granted through a wish to Shenron. The Dragon Balls of Namek, created by Grand Elder Guru and overseen by his successor Dende, were more powerful than Earth's and could grant wishes of greater scope, including the resurrection of fighters killed in the events of the Frieza saga on a scale that Earth's Dragon Balls could not have matched. Each planet's Dragon Balls carried the imprint of the Namekian who created them, and the power available through each set was bounded by the creator's capability. This meant that the transformation of what was possible through those wishes was directly tied to the development of the Namekian who held them in their care. Another quiet reminder that transformation in Dragon Ball was never isolated to the fighters in the foreground, but ran through the entire ecosystem of the series. The relationship between Saiyan Zenkai boosts and transformation was another thread worth noting. Not because Zenkai was a transformations became accessible. The Zenkai boost was the Saiyan biological response to near-fatal injury and recovery. The body, having been pushed to the edge of what it could survive, came back stronger than it had been before. The increase was not uniform but was consistently meaningful. A Saiyan who nearly died and recovered would emerge with a power level noticeably above where it had been at the moment of the life-threatening injury. This was part of why the Saiyan race had been such effective soldiers under Frieza's empire. Send them into dangerous situations, have them nearly die, and they came back stronger. The Zenkai mechanism was also part of the reason that certain transformations became accessible at specific moments. The pressure of a near-death experience was, in some configurations, the final piece of what a Saiyan needed to cross a threshold they had been approaching through training and combat. Super Perfect Cell had demonstrated a version of this principle, the Saiyan DNA incorporated into his design, allowing a Zenkai-like surge through the regeneration that followed his self-destruction. It was a feature that Jero had included deliberately, and it was one of those design choices that the story used to complicate the expected resolution of the Cell Saga's climactic moments. There was one more quality to Dragon Ball's transformation history worth dwelling on before this quiet tour reached its final rest, a quality that only became visible when the whole catalog was held in mind at once. The series never positioned any single transformation as the absolute, permanent, unreachable summit. Every form that arrived was eventually joined by something beyond it, not because the story was incapable of accepting limits, but because the story understood that the interesting thing was never the ceiling itself. It was the space between where a fighter stood and where the ceiling was. The gap that training and will and grief and rage and love and determination moved across. The ceiling kept rising because the fighters kept reaching, and the reaching was always the point. From the very first moonlit night on which a Saiyan tale triggered a change that swept consciousness away and left only something enormous and raw, to the quiet silver of ultra instinct inhabited with full emotional presence, the entire long arc of Dragon Ball transformation was a story about that reaching, about beings who were willing to become something they had not yet been because the moment required it of them. About the strange grace of change, arrived at through pressure, sustained through will, and carried forward into whatever came next. Thanks for drifting through these Dragon Ball stories with me tonight. If you're ready for more, there's another calm video waiting just to the left. Let it guide you deeper into rest. You might fall asleep to something new.